Well, welcome everyone. This is writing op-eds and letters to the editor, sprinkled in with, whatever other topics we want to touch on and like the sphere of working with media and journalists. Let me click. Oh, yes. Okay. Starting off, you could tap into your inner sloth and let me know which sloth you are today. You could put it in the chat. You could come off mute just so I get a vibe of how everyone's feeling. There's obviously no wrong sloth. I feel like I'm in number three a little bit, where I'm just like, oh, kind of sleepy day. It's really cold out. Oh, let's see. Okay, we got number six. Oh, I hope that's like a good chill because that seems like a little relaxing, which is good. Oh wait, no, that was six. That's the I looked at number nine. I fixed those up. Very different vibes. Awesome. Number three, number seven. That's funny. Thanks, Sloth. I love that. Okay. Okay. So like a mix of chaotic energy and sleepy energy today. So that's always going to be an interesting time. All right, so who am I? I told Jay we'd be able to see my very silly pets that are often in the background. Um, but my name's Jose. I use they, them pronouns as in Spanish. I'm based in Minnesota. I'm one of the co-coordinators for Spokes Hubs. And professionally, most of my career has been like outside of spicy stuff. The stuff has been in journalism, as a reporter and editor, doing a lot of engagement work, and then later training local journalists around the country. Just last year, I switched to working in a public library, which honestly shares a lot of the same skills, just a lot less really intense deadlines. So it's been a nice change of pace. So I wanted to quickly do a couple of questions that we'll just do via poll option. So I'm going to launch this quick poll. Um, you should see all three questions. So they're all yes or no. One is just, have you ever spoken to a journalist? Maybe you didn't make it into a story. Maybe you did a formal interview, or just like someone was asking you a couple of questions, not really for publication, just curious if anyone's ever spoken to a journalist. Also, then number two is, have you considered writing an op-ed or response to an article before? Maybe a little more seriously than beyond being like, oh, I'll sign up for this session and learn what it's about. So, and then have you actually ever written that op-ed or letter? Yeah, no judgment there. Just curious to see where everyone's at. Cool. I think we got everyone in there. So it seems like actually everyone here participating in the poll has spoken to a journalist in some capacity before, which is really not the norm. For like most people in this country, it will go their entire lives never having spoken to a journalist, whether local or national. So that's super interesting and good for me to know. Everyone's considered writing an op-ed or response article before, but the majority of us have not actually gotten to the point where we're writing that op-ed or letter. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so the first thing I kind of wanted to review is the difference between an op-ed and a letter to the editor, and when either one of these makes for, kind of like the most effective choice. Um, Op-eds are usually longer. Um, Publications might have caps on them or request to have certain minimums, like 400 word minimum. They're looking for something longer. They're typically written by a subject matter expert, so someone who, has that lived experience or maybe studies something. It could be, I mean, you see a lot of them run by like local politicians, even if they're, trying to advocate for a certain policy, things like that. Um, they typically are timely or current. Uh, Something might be going on policy wise, going through a legislature or like your local body. It could be tied to like a current event, something, whatever unfortunate latest airplane crash has happened, something like that, that kind of ties it in to the moment. And also, it's relevant to a publication's audience. So often, I'm that can really change depending on where you're pitching to, whether there's a national audience, a local audience, something just an audience as small as just like one specific town, things like that. Um, and op-eds typically go through a more heavy vetting and editing process as far as who they accept to write an op-ed, and then, you know, actually having an editor go through, edit the work, kind of go back and forth and questioning, are these all sound facts, things like that. Um, it's a little bit more intense. On the other hand, letter to the editors are much shorter. They're usually capped at something like 200 or 250 words, really brief. Oftentimes they're written by the audience of that publication. So it could just be like a regional paper you read. Like I always think of Minneapolis Star Tribune is like my local regional, well, my regional paper. Um, it's often in response to an article that has already come out. So more times than not, when someone is angry about something someone has written, it could be in response to an op-ed itself. It could be a response to a news article, or an editorial, things like that. And there's a lot less barriers to entry as far as the vetting and the editing of that. Usually as long as you are someone like within the audience. So like living in Minnesota, for example, when I'm talking about the Star Tribune, um, you don't need to be like a subject matter expert to have your letter to the editor printed. It's supposed to be more of like, all right, what is the local response to something we've written? And if, also, these are usually less prominent when it comes to like the website or in print. You'll usually, I mean, they're typically much shorter and smaller. So sometimes they won't even get published online. They'll only go in print. Usually they're alongside a ton of other small letters to the editor in one section. Um, and so, they are just not as prominent. Any questions so far? Cool. Feel free to throw them in the chat at any point. I want to talk a little bit about developing the strategy for when you want to do both and what will kind or when you want to do either one of these, but especially op-eds because they take more strategy than a letter to the editor, given how reactionary those are. So I'll go through this briefly, and then we're actually going to do a little bit of a timed like brainstorm exercise going through this ourselves. So typically, um, the op-ed strategy always kind of starts with like, what are you thinking about? Like, what's got you fired up? What have you pissed off? Like, anger is sometimes a great emotion to tap into when you are trying to get something done. And I know as someone who is neurodiverse and struggles to get things done. Sometimes I kind of need that fire and incentive to get me going and really like take me through a project or writing something. Um, so really focusing on maybe something that's been really on your mind that you can't seem to let go of is kind of a nice way of identifying, all right, what do I want to be writing about? What's really important right now? And that kind of leads into the next thing of that piece, that what's important right now. Is there a piece of legislation going through that's really timely? Did something just happen locally that is kind of on your mind or affecting the community around you? Sometimes it might be something people don't really know a lot about. So this is a good way of getting attention to that, much more directly than, going through a bunch of different people and trying to ask them to cover it. Is just bringing attention to it yourself. Again, like who's your audience? So are you trying to talk to neighbors around you? Are you trying to reach legislators? That is a whole other subject of publications. Some publications are very specifically focused on legislation or covering a state government. So you might want to be looking at a whole other news organization or magazine that might focus on something different. Um, this kind of leads into the publications and news organizations that cater to that audience. You actually don't want to overlook trade magazines either. They're there's a lot less news nowadays as far as like what we typically think of like local and national newspapers and stuff like that, have really cut down, but trade magazines tend to be really strong and they might capture the exact audience that you want. Um, and from there, it's kind of looking into, all right, now that I know kind of what I want to talk about and who I want to talk to, uh, looking at those organizations' guidelines for submitting something. Um, it'll vary completely organization to organization, as well as if you decide to go with an op-ed or a letter to the editor. And then I really want people to kind of start thinking about what kind of support they have after publishing, even if it's just like your personal circle of support. Sometimes op-eds or letters can get lost in the news cycle. It's like you get it out there, which is awesome, but you might not get a lot of attention. Sometimes it might get a ton of attention. Sometimes it's not the attention you want either. um, and so it could lead to like a lot of kind of like lashing out for people who might not agree with you or not willing to, hear what you're trying to say. And, obviously, oftentimes gets put on social media. It might get passed in social media circles that are really unfriendly and, could lead to harassment. All those kind of things you want to think about when just preparing to put something out there and knowing like, okay, do you have a friend who can support you? Maybe someone who is willing to tell you what comment sections to avoid, things like that. And just kind of be there for you during that, just because you never really know what's going to happen. Most of the time, it's like a quick flash in the pan and everyone kind of moves on, but it's good to plan for those kind of things. Okay, so this is the kind of like brainstorming moment. So what I'm hoping is that we can start putting together a little bit of an outline for something that you're interested in potentially doing later outside of this workshop. And actually, I'm gonna pause. Oh wait, no, let's pause screen sharing. I'll pause on recording when I find it so that afterwards we can chat a little bit about it. Um, actually, Jaylee, do you know where the stop recording is? And we mentioned this a little bit already, but I did want to mention some tools for writing and editing your work. Um, some might seem, I mean, I think a lot of you have do extensive work in a lot of areas, so you probably know all of these. Sometimes it's just nice to have a reminder. Definitely find like be reading op-ed, like even if it's in your local magazine, local alt weekly, local paper. You can look at the op-ed sections of like larger publications and larger magazines on their website just to get a sense of like what people are writing about, like how long is the writing. This is great if you already have a publication in mind that you want to pitch to, so you get a sense of, what kind of things do they accept. um, and that way, and also if there's like a topic that they're really focusing on, um, like in their news coverage or even in the op-ed section, that give you a little bit of inspiration for like, okay, maybe this is a good time to pitch X, Y, and Z on, this topic. Um, I always love a timed writing exercise. Um, so, don't be afraid to just throw whatever on paper or, typing in. I'm always typing in. I don't know why I say on paper, for 10 minutes before actually trying to organize something. I'm a big fan of just writing in small chunks and then reorganizing it 50 times until I get it the way I want. Um, I have a lot of mixed feeling. Well, actually, I have a lot of negative feelings towards AI, but that's just me. And I do know that AI tools can be useful for people with writer's block. Not to say that like the AI tool is going to write your whole op-ed or letter, but just kind of give you a different, you know, kind of examples of like different wording that might be useful. Just a little bit of inspiration when you have kind of less energy or feel like you've hit that wall. Um, we did include having access to a ghostwriter specifically because even though it's very rare, in op-eds, and I mean definitely not letters to yet. Well, I won't say that. Um, but Spokes Hub has worked with one of our trainers to kind of be a ghostwriter and work with people on op-eds for like issues that Spokes Hub and Woodhull find really important. So in when in doubt, like definitely come to us and ask if that is something that's accessible at the moment. Um, and I think, and Jaylee, remind me if I'm wrong, but I know sometimes Savannah like and Woodhull are looking to talk about specific topics, so they might also, put some information in our newsletter when they're looking to work with someone. I think that happened once before. Um, and I also put the caveat of like usually letters to the editor don't have ghostwriters, and I only say that because letters to the editor have long been a tool for like far right causes, where they just like mass blast local papers and with like the same, letter to the editor or op-ed or something like that. And, they might get like a local person in that area to like literally send it in. But this has like long been a tool. And because obviously all of those smaller publications everywhere across the country have very limited resources and they don't work with one another on any daily basis. It's like they don't even know that they're all getting the same exact message, just with like maybe a different person's name each time. um, and I don't know how much that happens anymore, but especially with the rise of social media. But maybe like 10 years ago that was a really big tool. um, as far as editing, when you're trying to like pare down your wording or trying to make sure you didn't have any typos beyond like the typical spell check, reading your work line by line, like in reverse, is actually really helpful because you're no longer skipping over, like every fourth word that you do when you're reading something in order, especially something that you've written and read so many times over and over. Going backward kind of breaks up that routine and helps you catch errors, or catch like funky punctuation, things like that that you just might want to avoid turning in. Of course, same can be done with by a friend, just handing over your work to them, or reaching out to us here at Spokes Hub or a peer in the program and asking them to read something over. um, can be incredibly helpful for writing and editing. I do this, done this with friends my whole life. And they kind of always help me think of something that I didn't even think of to begin with. So that definitely makes it piece better most of the time. Does anyone have any questions there before we move on? Okay, cool. Um, oh, Jaylee, what's up?
Just the privacy concern that some folks might have, just like your second point there, like that you likely cannot be anonymous. In this day and age, just kind of wanted to maybe talk about a little bit, if we could, just some of the risks that, folks might be opening themselves up to should they choose
Hmm.
to to write. I think that it might just be worth kind of exploring that a little bit more if you could speak to that, just some of those concerns that they might have, if they, are opening themselves up to, sort of doxing and these kinds of things. It may be worth like, kind of you know, making sure
Yeah.
that they are on delete me, that none of their information is public, just some, maybe some best practices if they decide to write something that's a little more spicy, just maybe some best practices to make sure their privacy is protected.
Yeah, totally. Um, so yeah, most publications, whether you're being interviewed or you're writing something for them, will allow people to go like to be anonymous. That's expanded a little bit more in the past, about 5 or so years, but mostly for like people being interviewed whose safety could be at risk for, whatever reason. But as far as like an op-ed or a letter to the editor, I don't think I've ever seen one published anonymously. So you should bank on like having to give like a name, and especially an op-ed, usually people have like their name and like some information on what makes them that subject matter um like expert for writing the piece to begin with. Letter to the editor is usually like just a name, or maybe if it's like a statewide publication, might be like a name and like the town or city you live in, which could still be like really broad. So yeah, of course that has privacy implications. This is one of those moments where I really go with the recommendation of like use an advocate name. Even if you don't usually use one, um, you might want to consider doing one for like a published piece. And as and I would say like as long as it's not like a really, I don't want to say out there name, but for lack of a better term, like, just something that like doesn't sound like a legal name, like people aren't going to question it. So don't offer up the information. Like don't be asking, oh, can I be anonymous or can I use a pen name or a pseudonym? Don't ask the question. Like just pick an advocate name and go with it. um, that's kind of like my best advice. So like unless they're like really bragging for information, um, is just kind of assume they're going to go with it. And like, like I would just put Jose Rico on it and be like, great, that's my advocate name. Seems close enough. Like they're not gonna like question it. So um, I just don't bring it up myself. I definitely have had a lot of sources come to me being like, can I be anonymous? Can I give a pen name? And things like that. Even when they're, or like, can I make up a name for an interview? And a lot of those cases, like even ones that really aren't, where like safety isn't really involved in it, I'd be like, no. But also, I'm not going and Googling every single person I've talked to, especially for something, that's really simple. So if you want to stay a little bit more anonymous or a little bit more private, I just say like pick a name and roll with that one. Um, because the big chances that no one's going to question it going through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, totally. I would also recommend like if you're not someone who usually locks down their socials, lock down your socials when you know something's going to be published soon, in anticipation in case it does kind of get blown up. Um, sometimes blowing up, whether good or bad, is the point. And so that's something like you can make a decision on for yourself. I know myself, I tend to just keep everything locked down now at this point as far as social media. Um, but that also kind of leads to this point of like, you should ask them a little bit about, when something will be printed, what format it's going to be printed in, like, is this online only? And you'll know by the publication, like, what kind of publication they are. But if they have a print and a digital version, like, ask if it's going to be in both or just one or the other. Um, things that sometimes like stuff like letters to the editor might only go in print and like they don't bother putting it, online digitally. So like that digital footprint is less of a concern for you, but you want to really get clarification on that. Some other things to expect with a letter to the editor, you can be, I mean, double check, but you could be almost certain that if you meet the guidelines, especially like the word count guidelines, it's not going to be edited. Um, it might be like a couple of grammar things might be changed, like a period or a comma or something like that, but you can kind of bank on it not being edited. But op-eds can look really different, and it definitely depends on the publication. Um, it'll often depend a lot on just how much the publication has in terms of like resource and people power to go through editing and fact checking. Um, I mean, I think any good op-ed editor would fact check all that stuff, but I've definitely read some where I'm like, that's not even true. It's like that's not true. I don't know how this made it to publication. So, weird stuff can happen, but definitely expect a little bit of that process. And I would say ask like once your pitch is accepted, what that process is, so you know exactly what it'll look like. That's kind of going over some of the, oh, actually meant to go back. Some of the same stuff, ask on what day, or they can give you a range of time in which it will be published. Sometimes that can totally depend on like room in a physical magazine, or, like room in a newspaper, or, are so and so on vacation, so they're not publishing as much on their website at the moment, things like that. So sometimes they'll just give you a range of time in which it will be published, but you just want to be a little bit ready if it's going to get a lot of traction. Um, Again, ask about the editing process and what to expect. Is it going to be more than one person editing your op-ed or your letter, or is it just going to be like the one editor you're working with? Back when there was a lot more journalists in newsrooms, you likely would have at least one editor and one copy editor look at it. I like don't know places that have copy editors anymore, and it's a huge bummer. But sometimes you might still see that. Um, Definitely ask of whoever you're working with, like, oh, if this is getting printed, whether it's online or in a physical copy, like, can you send me the link when it's published online, or like, or can you hold on to a copy or two for me and I'll come pick it up, or can you mail it to me, something like that, just so you have like that physical copy is always great to have. um but also like the link if you want to be sharing it around, or if other people want to be sharing it in their networks, that way you can pass it along too. Oftentimes, I know as a reporter, I meant to do this with tons of people who I interviewed, and oftentimes, forget, or like ADHD brain takes over. So it doesn't hurt to remind someone. And also ask if it's going to be published as its own thing on social media, like social media posts about it. And if so, like, is that, you know, the same day it gets published online, or is that going to be, in the weeks after it? Sometimes people like to bring back older content. And so if they're bringing back much older content, like a letter editor you wrote, or an op-ed you wrote, I don't know, a month ago, which is a little bit unlikely, but they might, um, you know, you might not get a heads up, but just know that they could bring that back, and maybe ask if you could get a heads up, like for the first time it goes onto social media, so you can be ready for that. Cool. And then this is just my personal email. This is Rico at proton.me is what I'm using for all my advocate work. Or you can email spokeshub at Will Help Foundation in order to reach me if you have questions, or if you want someone to read something over for you. I'm very happy to do editing for folks, or just give whatever feedback or opinion you're looking for. I'll go ahead and stop the